This is my 76th video on my work with OO gauge. See part 1 of this series for my reasons for getting into OO gauge when I already had a lot invested in working in N gauge and I didn't really have space available for a large, fully operational OO gauge layout. Also see my lengthy series on my N gauge railway modelling for smaller and more complex scenery and smaller scale trains running. This part deals with adding a bunch of scenic accents, chiefly figures and road vehicles, to my OO gauge layouts. Chiefly the Hornby layout, although some extra items did also get added to the Bachmann EZ Track layout. The title Scenic Accents, not necessarily what I would first think of calling these items, occurred to me because I used Woodland Scenics Scenic Accents glue to fix most of the smaller items in place. More on that as we go along. Most of the scenic items here were recently acquired, although some had been sitting around for a while waiting to be used. Nigel of British Model Trains was kind enough to give me this collection of old road vehicles that he had picked up as part of a layout collection that he acquired. He knew that my OO gauge modelling was focused on the LMS in the 1930s, and I'd particularly spoken with him about acquiring a suitable bus. He also knew that I had a long history with Airfix and their kits. Quite a number of the items seen here were produced from the old Airfix kits for military vehicles, the RAF fueling set, for example, which I built in my youth. The tankers and Bowsers all come from that, I believe. Less obviously, the closed Lms Lorry and the green open lorry are both derived from the old Airfix military ambulance kit, and the horse-drawn vehicles were, I think, originally Airfix Wild West items. The 3 double-decker buses are all repainted dinky toys from Meccano, the same company that originated Hornby trains. The single-decker bus is, I believe, a Maudsley bus from a kit that's still sold by Pico, although here finished as an LMS bus, and I don't think the kit was ever sold as that. I have no idea as to the origin of the 2 LMS trailers with the associated tractor seen at right. I was sure that some of these items could well be employed on my layout, although others were really too late for my prototype. These were new scenic items that I'd bought from British Model Trains. When I did my initial detail placement on the Hornby layout, I didn't have any painted seated figures, so the benches were left empty, so I'd been looking to pick up some suitable seated figures, and whilst I already had fire buckets from the Springside white metal kit on my station platforms, I figured that more fire buckets should be seen in other locations. Here are the seated figures unpacked. I noticed one guy manages to appear in both sets, and the children aren't actually seated. I do like that bench, though. Here's the Woodland Scenics Scenic Accents glue that I used when placing many of the smaller items in this video. I can't say that I agree with the claim on the bottle of instant placement, no holding required. That seems to me to imply that the glue is a lot tackier than it actually is. I found it to be quite liquid and not in fact a hold at all until it dried quite a bit. Maybe it might instantly hold little bits of vegetation with almost no weight, but it certainly doesn't instantly hold things like figures, except in as much as you're placing them so that they'd stay in place by gravity anyway. Still, it does work quite well as a mild tack for holding figures on benches or in place on the ground, although it will really only work for the latter with figures that have their own bases. If you want to stick figures to the ground just by their feet, I think you'd need something stronger, such as CA. Here are the new fire buckets sorted out. There were 2 racks, 4 buckets with black handles, 2 buckets with red handles and 2 with unpainted handles, and a sort of stack of 3 with no handles. These buckets were quite a bit bigger than the Springside ones, and seemed perhaps really too large for OO gauge, but I decided that I should just about be able to get away with them. I wanted to put fire buckets on the side of this signal box, which was built from the Metcalf GWR signal box kit. I fished out a figure to allow me to gauge how the buckets might be attached to look reasonably handy for OO gauge humans to use. Based on that comparison with a figure, I attached a rack for the buckets to the wall of the signal box, using rocket card glue. I think that looks about right, maybe a little high, but not impossibly so, and as I say, these buckets are rather big. For the 2 buckets that came with unpainted handles, I painted the handles black. That might not have been my first choice, but I figured I'd just make them consistent with the others. It was possible to just hang these buckets on the rack without using glue. That wasn't possible with the Springside kit, where each bucket needed to be glued to the rack. I wanted to put fire buckets on both of the signal boxes on my Hornby layout. This is the other box, a Hornby plastic item, again with a figure for scale. I wasn't too sure whether the rocket glue would work for attaching the rack to the wall of the plastic signal box. It does say on the bottle that it bonds plastic, but I've always used it for porous materials, chiefly card. The rocket glue did in fact work okay for attaching this rack, although it needed to be supported for longer before it set than would have been the case with card. Here's that rack with its buckets in place. This collection of figures was left over from when I was doing the detailing of the station on my Hornby layout. Whilst selecting figures to go on the station, I also put aside these figures as likely being suitable for placement elsewhere around the layout, but I hadn't got round to doing anything with them until now. There were several duplicates amongst the figures, so I sorted them out in order to be clearer as to what I had. 2 postmen, 3 hotel porters, 2 guys with low lamps, 2 guys with raised lamps, 2 guys with shovels, and 3 figures that weren't duplicated. I had 4 new Oxford Road vehicles that I'd bought, 3 from British Model Trains and 1 from another vendor at the Kitchener Train Show. I opened these up, 3 Scammell mechanical horse vehicles and a little Austin 7. I detached them from the bases to which they came attached. Easier said than done, as it turned out, as the Scammell vehicles were screwed onto their bases so tightly that I had to use a big screwdriver and a lot of force to get them off. I think they must use a machine to tighten those screws, and they should turn it down a bit. This was another little horse-drawn vehicle that I'd picked up from British Model Trains some time ago, but had never got around to placing. I wanted to find something suitable to put on it as a load. I divided the vehicles from this lot up. Those on the left I felt were too late for my prototype, being based on vehicles introduced in the 1940s or later, and I'm modelling the 1930s. I really like the dinky buses, and I'd like to find a use for them in the future, but I really don't think they'd be appropriate for my current layouts. The models on the right seemed appropriate so far as their prototypes were concerned. I wasn't entirely sure about the ex-Wild West horse-drawn items in the middle. As it turned out, although I rather liked these items, I didn't end up using them. Ultimately, they just seemed too large for 00 gauge and so didn't fit in, especially on a small layout. It might have been easier to get away with using them at the back of a larger layout. Here's the card signal box with its fire buckets in place. And here's the Hornby plastic signal box in place with its fire buckets and a figure. I put the family with the bench beside the village store and post office. Perhaps they're waiting for a bus or something. Here are a couple of the seated figures on one of the benches on my station. For some reason I just couldn't make my camera focus properly on these figures, and I tried 4 times. These are the best 2. I put the loving couple on the bench at the other end of the far platform. I had no trouble focusing on them, and I really don't understand the difference. I also put seated figures on the benches on the near platform, although they'll mostly only be seen from the back. This was the best I could manage in terms of viewing the benches on the near platform other than from the back, basically photographed by leaning right up against the wall at the end of the layout. I placed the postman coming out from the post office. I put one of the hotel porters by the Plough Hotel, which was built from the Airfix Daypole Country Inn kit. I put another hotel porter by the railway hotel, built from a super quick card kit. One of the guys with a shovel went by the coal merchants, with the scales and a figure from an earlier set. A guy with a raised lamp went in the yard beside the track leading to the turntable. He was another one my camera wouldn't focus on, presumably because there were just too many other things near to him. Here's a guy by the level crossing, waiting, I guess, to open the gates when he can. And I placed a man on the platform of the Metcalfe signal box. This chap with a hammer went beside the double-engine shed at the left of the layout. And another chap with a lamp went beside the siding leading down to that shed. I put a couple of figures by the station signal box. Maybe I should have made more effort to blend the bases of the figures, or even taken them off their bases. Here's the new little Austin 7 by the Plough Hotel. I put the LMS Parcels traffic trailer on the weighbridge. And I put one of the Scammels with a flatbed on the road beside where the Airfix crane was working. The Maudsley bus I put on the road coming down to the corner by the station. I decided that this horse-drawn wagon appeared to be loaded with coal sacks, so I put it by the coal merchants. Here's another horse-drawn wagon on the road. The best I could come up with as a load for this was this, which is actually an N-gauge container, but I don't think it looks too bad. I parked this Lms Lorry back in the corner behind the billboard that Bill Stickers is working on. Here's another angle on that. It might be a hair on the big side, but I don't think it looks too bad. It was probably supposed to be 72nd scale, whereas 00 is 1:76. The horse-drawn wagon is just going round that same corner. And here's the other corner on that side by the coal merchants and the crane. Here's the front area by the Plough Hotel and the store and cafe. And here's the other side with the goods shed across from the railway hotel. Here's the front Junction signal box with the Plough Hotel seen behind it. I placed the extra duplicate figures and a couple of the vehicles on my Bachmann layout in the basement. Here's a postman by the Airfix cottage on that layout. And here's a hotel porter by the King's Head. I assigned an extra guy with a shovel to the coal merchants on this layout. Here's a general view of the end with those figures. I put the other Scammel flatbed in the yard of this layout by the engine shed. Here's a wider view of that yard, which already had a Scammel parcels vehicle coming through. I put the other horse-drawn wagon on the road in the middle of the village on this layout. Here's a wider view of that. The green lorry was parked over near the cattle dock on the Bachmann layout. A wider view of the village and the cattle dock on the Bachmann layout. Here's the whole of the Hornby layout after this exercise. Rather busy, I guess. And finally, a bit more focused on the centre of the Hornby layout, showing many of the new figures and vehicles. A lot going on. I do tend to keep adding things, and I might squeeze in a few more items yet. Perhaps a greenhouse in the garden of the White Cottage, and perhaps some figures on the patio of the cafe. It may be midwinter currently here in Canada, but it's always summer on this layout.